everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the podcast, The Brain Tease. I'm your host, Rachel, and let's talk brains. So, on this first episode, I would like to explore dopamine. And as you heard in the intro, it is so common in music these days, and as a person in the neuroscience field, this freaks me out a little bit. It would be as if you heard the word mitochondria or calculus in a song. It's very strange to me. I don't know how it gains so much traction in songs. Also, dopamine popped up when I was watching a YouTube video of The Ellen Show, and Ellen was talking to Justin Bieber. I can't believe I'm talking about Justin Bieber and the brain in the same sentence, but Ellen was talking to Justin Bieber about how when he was younger and on tour, something was off with his dopamine levels, and then Justin Bieber responded to Ellen, and he was like, "You're on tour, the depletion of dopamine happened, and I was going out every night, and I wasn't giving myself the proper nutrients." And I was just a little bit confused on how Ellen DeGeneres and Justin Bieber are having this conversation about dopamine. And it just made me think, do people actually know what dopamine is? Or are we just using the word dopamine? So let's get this straight. What is dopamine? So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which means it's a chemical messenger and it's produced in the brain. And it's involved in a lot of processes in your brain, such as learning, memory, and movement. So people with Parkinson's disorder have a dysregulation of dopamine, which is why their movements are not stable. But I think dopamine is popular popular in pop culture because it's famously involved in reward and addiction. So one example of how dopamine works in the brain is cocaine. So this is not the best analogy, but you can think of your brain as a sink and the water as chemical messengers. So hear me out for a second. So your brain needs certain chemicals, the water will flow in. When there's too much of that certain chemical, it'll drain out. Now, using cocaine is almost like putting a plug in your sink, and you're flooding your brain with that chemical messenger of dopamine. And that flooding of your brain with dopamine is what gives you that euphoric feeling when taking cocaine. So I think this phenomenon of a dopamine rush is why it's so popular in music. It is just another phrase to term a euphoric feeling, I guess. But dopamine is important not just for cocaine users. It's involved in a lot of processes in everyday life. A lot of things can stimulate the release of dopamine, such as eating delicious food or having sex. These are rewarding activities, so they can stimulate dopamine. And dopamine is not just involved in these short-term dopamine rushes. There are actually long-term effects of dopamine as well. So here's a fun example. When I was a kid, and even to this day, I've gone on a lot of road trips, and during these road trips, I would get pretty hungry. And as I'm getting pretty hungry, I look to a sign on the road, and what do I see? It says, in 50 miles, and it has a picture of the golden arches of McDonald's. And just seeing that logo of McDonald's, I am not sponsored by McDonald's, by the way, just seeing that logo makes me crave McDonald's. It's so silly, but I've seen this logo since I was a kid, and because I've seen it for so many years and I've associated it with yummy, high-calorie food, I've associated the logo with that food. So that's kind of a silly example of how dopamine can assist in those long-term reward associations. Some other notes on dopamine. Dopamine, it is theorized, is essential to motivation. So So the wanting of doing something. So in an example with rats who basically had no dopamine in their brains, they did not take food when they were starving. Even though they liked the food, they didn't take it because they didn't have dopamine in their brains. So dopamine is really, really important. But with that being said, I think when people talk about dopamine levels in their body, it's just not accurate. Like when Justin Bieber was talking to Ellen about his dopamine levels, like I doubt that on his tour bus he had someone checking his dopamine levels after every concert. I don't understand why he couldn't just say, I was depressed and I was struggling with addiction. But putting the word dopamine levels in conversation makes it sound so much more, quote, scientific. And mental illness is a real thing. So even Justin Bieber, who has 130 million followers on Instagram as of today, if he can't say that, he's struggled with mental illness and has to talk about dopamine levels instead, that's an issue. But that's a whole other podcast about mental illness stigma. Anyway, on the flip side, dopamine is not the end-all, be-all of happiness. So dopamine is involved in reward and motivation, so you may think that it might be involved in depression. So there was a study that actually gave a drug to people with depression that increased their dopamine levels. And though they had increased dopamine, they did not properly learn the reward in the task. So that just goes to show that there is more to understanding depression, and I guess on the flip side, happiness, than just dopamine levels. So lastly, with this whole dopamine craze in our society, I just had to talk about the trend sweeping Silicon Valley as well as the world, known as dopamine fasting. Now, when I first heard about this, I was super freaked out. Just the description was so... I just have to tell you this description because it'll freak you out as well. So, it was described as the, quote, latest fad in Silicon Valley. By cutting back on things like food, sex, alcohol, social media, and technology, followers believe that they can reset the brain to be more effective and appreciate simple things more easily. Some even go so far as avoiding all social activities and even eye contact. Whew, well, that is a pretty wild trend. But anyway, this term was coined by Dr. Cameron Seppa of the University of California, San Francisco, and he wrote a viral article that first explained this that got over 100,000 views in less than a day. But in his article, he explained that dopamine fasting is not about avoiding socializing, and it is not just for tech bros. And he also wrote that dopamine fasting is not actually about reducing dopamine. It's about reducing impulsive behavior. So, for example, he suggests using it for any habits that distract you from your work or your social life, or any habit that you have trouble cutting down even when you try. So some examples he lists include emotional eating, internet or gaming addiction, gambling or shopping addiction, porn or masturbation addiction, thrill or novelty seeking addiction, or overuse of recreational drugs. So what dopamine fasting is, an example would be, let's say, for phone addiction. If you think you use your phone too much and it's affecting your work or social life, maybe for 1 hour instead of using your phone, replace using your phone with a healthy activity like taking a walk. And that's basically it, but it is called dopamine fasting and it is sweeping the world, apparently. Dopamine fasting, I think, makes a lot of sense in this day and age. It's basically this whole cool, sexy, scientific dopamine phrase is actually using techniques of therapy that have been used since the 1960s. But I think that Dr. Seppa has packaged these therapy techniques for the modern age, for 2020, for millennials. And all in all, I like the concept, but again, I think the name is misleading. Anytime you put the word dopamine in a phrase in pop culture, odds are it's not very accurate brain-wise. But anyway, I feel like this is a pretty cool trend because it does use aspects of therapy, and I think therapy is important. Feeling good is important, and regardless of if you are diagnosed with mental disorder or not, therapy is important. So do the things you like. Maybe take a step back from things that are distracting you from your work or social life. Call it what you want, but maybe don't call it dopamine fasting.